Welcome, everyone. Great to see you all here, and thank you for making an effort to come and see us today. I'd like to start with, but do the clicker first, acknowledging. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. Our topic today, creating impact through purpose, balancing value and ESG responsibility for a better future. On behalf of the ENFP Strategic Alliance of HLB Manjud and CommBank, I'd like to introduce some of the partners and our CBA staff that are here today. We've got Kim Kellaway from Head of Clients and Markets. Do we have Mariana? Oh, there you are. I didn't see you come in the door. Nicholas Guest. And from CBA, we've got Blake Sinclair. And we've also got Emma Stevenson. So Emma's new to our group, but she's not new to CBA. Emma's looking after non-for-profits in our major client group, and Emma's going to feature in our events going forward. So I'd love you to welcome her. And any questions, please come and see Emma from CBA. And in terms of presenters, we've got Sarah Laylor and we've got Agneta, and they're talking on ESG and commodities, carbon and trade. Just in terms of our speakers, Sarah Laylor, our General Manager of ESG, heads up a team that supports business customers to manage risk and capitalise on opportunities in the transition to a more sustainable and low carbon economy, which includes all stages of sustainability journey. So we're very fortunate to have Sarah with us today. Nicholas Guest, Partner of Assurance and Advisory, Head of ESG Australasia. That's a long title at HLB Manjud. Nicholas works with organisations developing technology, products, solutions to support the low carbon, clean energy transition, and is the co-lead on HLB's Sustainable Steering Committee. He assists organisations develop and evolve their ESG sustainability strategies and prepare for current and emerging reporting obligations. I should put up our photos. And we have Agneta, I'm not going to pronounce your surname, Director of CBA Commodities, Trade and Carbon. And Agneta specialises in environmental commodity markets, working across demand and supply side, carbon trading, carbon project financing, carbon climate technology investments, Indigenous carbon projects and government projects. So we're very fortunate to have such amazing speakers today, and we're hoping that you'll have some takeaways from each of them that you can share with your board and ignite some discussions around ESG and carbon to make sure that you're relevant for the future. We really see a window of opportunity for you to share discussions around ESG with your partners, your sponsors. So we feel this is a really informative space for you to have those takeaways and to be able to articulate your own elevated speech with your clients and with your partners. So I'd like to welcome Sarah. You. Get you ready. There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yvette, for that lovely introduction. And I've heard amazing things about this lunch, so I'm actually very excited to be here. It sounds like it's just generally great fun, but also lots of very interesting topics that get discussed here. So I'm going to try and do a really good job, so Yvette will invite me back again at some stage in the future. Like Yvette said, so I work in the business bank here at CBA. My team looks after ESG and sustainable finance across the business bank. And what that means in practical terms is we're thinking about ESG risk within our lending portfolio. So we're thinking through what are the environmental, social, or governance topics that actually eventuate within the transactions or the clients that we deal with, and how do we make sure that our clients understand those risks and how do we help them manage them. And then the other big part of what my team does is we help customers with sustainable finance. So it's essentially about deploying capital to support businesses that are investing or purchasing assets or initiatives that essentially will deliver in some way, shape, or form a positive environmental or social outcome, which typically usually means they're going to deliver on a really positive economic outcome as well, because all these three things very much merge together and go hand in hand, and they need to. Sustainability inherently is about, environmental sustainability, societal sustainability, as well as economic sustainability. Okay, so I'm going to really try and just give everybody a bit of kind of set the context and set the scene on what's happening in the sustainability world, a bit overseas and also here in Australia. How do we think about it here at CBA, and then take it down a bit more into the business side of things, and really kind of, as Yvette said, the intent and the hope here is that by understanding a little bit more around how this is all playing out within the local business community here in Australia, and Nick will talk to mandatory climate reporting, which is a really important part of what's playing out at the moment. It will help you better understand the context of those companies that you partner with, and really try and understand and see where might there be an alignment in what they're doing from a sustainability perspective to what you might be doing as well, and where can that alignment really deliver benefits for all parties. Okay, internationally, I think it's fairly well acknowledged that Europe leads the way when it comes to sustainability. Australia is probably roughly 5 years behind, is what people will kind of typically say. I want to talk about leadership. A lot of the time people will interpret that to mean, and this is the reality, the regulation. So regulation in Europe is a fair bit further advanced. And in a lot of ways, it's very helpful for us over here in Australia, because what we will see will be an adoption over here in Australia of a lot of the regulations that were in Europe. So we get to have a really kind of early insight into what's likely to be coming. So that's very helpful. But the other way that I think there's a difference in the European market, and this will be general, it'll be a generalization, but there's actually a difference culturally and with the mindset over there, just within the community and within consumers. And I grew up in Ireland, and I had a trip back home about 6 weeks ago for my brother's wedding, and maybe my ears were pricked because I'm in the role that I'm in now, which I hadn't been the last time I was home. But every advert on the radio, every kind of billboard, for the big ones or the ones kind of in shops, sustainability was everywhere, just in the general branding. I just couldn't believe it. It was very starkly different to what we see here, where there will be businesses that definitely brand themselves in that way, but it's a very kind of specific. It's certainly not like a mainstream, every single company bringing it into it, but every company's story that they were telling, whether that was a milk carton to a hotel business to whatever it might be, they went to great lengths to make sure that there was some explanation of what they were doing in sustainability. And I could really just feel a different sense of it, just culturally, and just kind of walking in the street and chatting to people. I find it really interesting. The other thing that you can really see over in Europe is the innovation that's going into technology to support some of the challenges that we have in reducing carbon and moving to a more environmentally sustainable environment. So really interesting over there, and a lot that we can learn, and we must continue to do that. I think here in Australia, the big news here is mandatory climate reporting, which, as I said, Nick will talk to, and I do think that is going to be incredibly helpful for accelerating the journey ahead of us here in Australia. I think also in terms of other things that's happening, I think You've got on the political front, you've got Future Made in Australia, which has got a lot of really positive things in there in terms of sustainability outcomes. But I think, as we read in the paper every day, there are very many different views within kind of political circles when it comes to this topic. It can be quite polarizing. And what that will often lead to will be a bias to inaction. So we see a lot of our customers who are just waiting to see. We've got an election next year. What's that going to mean? We've obviously had the election results in the US come through. And so with that uncertainty does come a bit of a pause, and people just waiting to see. I think the other thing that we are actually seeing, though, in Australia, for companies that have got either headquarters in Europe, or if they've got very strong trade relationships with the European corridor, or if they've got capital or investments from Europe, they're the companies in Australia that are ahead of the game and have been on this journey for quite a while. And again, I think that's where we can learn a lot. It's about really kind of seeking to look and learn, and where can we learn, and those kind of companies are definitely well on their way. At Commonwealth Bank, we have now issued, I think it's our third climate report. The first one was, I think, 13 pages. The one that we published about 2 months ago now was like maybe 120 plus. And what that says to me is, maybe we've got a very long climate report, maybe it's too long. However, it's an indication of the appetite from our stakeholders to understand and see what we're doing in this space. And when I talk about our stakeholders, obviously there's our investors, there's our customers, there's the communities that we serve, but we're really seeing it from our employees as well. And interestingly, chatting to a number of the accountancy firms as well, and often the law firms, that's coming through really strongly as well, as they try to attract graduates into the market. Like, they're asking and wanting to know what is your organization doing in this space, which I think is fantastic. So our position, our public position, is that we support net zero by 2050. It is a very important topic at the top of our organization. So at board and at our executive leadership team, the role that the Commonwealth Bank is going to play as we transition to a net zero economy, we take that role very seriously. We've got 4 strategic pillars here at the bank, and one of those strategic pillars is all about the role that we want to play, the leadership role that we want to play through the transition. And we think that we've got a very important role to play and can really make a significant impact in this space, and the decisions that we make can be very meaningful. But we use the language, and it's very intentional, this word, we use the language inclusive transition in our climate report. And that word inclusive is incredibly important, because this is not a black and white space. If you ever want to work in however many shades of gray there are, like, this is honestly the space to do it. And so we think very deeply and carefully, and again at a board and an executive level, about some of the positions we might take, or the decisions and the policies that we may adopt. Really thinking through impact to community, impact to the economy, impact to society, as well as impact to the environment and our business. As we take that down into, well, how does that all play out kind of in practical terms with our business customers? As I said, there's really kind of two lenses that we look at it, and that's through the lens of risk, but also through returns and opportunities. When we lend to business customers, obviously we're looking to see and assess, can the customer repay their debt? I think about 2 years ago, we've actually introduced an official, what we call an ESG assessment. And what we're trying to do there is really understand, is there an environmental or a social risk or a governance issue within that business that actually is so material and is if not well managed, could result in an inability for that company to repay their debt. So it's actually part of our credit risk process. And, examples would be of an environmental risk, like, is there an asset or a business that's located in a geography that has got, very high risk of an extreme weather event? Is this company, mismanaging pollution or waste, and actually this something is going to happen, and you know, their business could no longer be viable and therefore they can't repay their debt. On the social side, it's often looking at things like animal welfare, modern slavery, human rights, those kind of things. But to be clear, it's not that we're kind of out there looking to find an issue and then we're not going to extend any debt to those businesses. It's much more about understanding them, making sure our customers understand them and that they're managing, and then helping them if they're not managing them, you know, in the optimal way. How do we actually help them get there? So it's much more about working with our clients. It's certainly not about you know, withdrawing when we see some of these risks play through, and we do see these risks come through. But I think for the most part, our customers are very aware of them as well, because ultimately they impact the economic outcomes of their business. In terms of what we're hearing from our clients, it is starting to shift. I think in the last couple of years, so this team has been going for 3 years. I was actually chatting to my predecessor last week, because I had a lot of events coming up. I said, well, what did you talk about when you were doing, you know, these events when you were in the role? And she's like, oh, I used to have to explain what E stood for, what S stood for, and what G stood for. And I actually thought, what a great, like, kind of symbolic way to actually demonstrate genuinely the progress that has been made in terms of people understanding ESG, sustainability. You know, we have a long way to go, but I actually think that's only within 3 years. 3 years is nothing. So there is a huge amount of progress being made, and I think the mandatory climate reporting is going to change things even more. And interestingly, in the last 6 months, that's probably where we've seen a real uptick in appetite to engage from our clients, appetite from boards to really start to understand this, and really, you know, starting to ask management, what's our plan here, what we're doing here. Other practical things that we're seeing play through, for example, with the Olympics in Brisbane, any organization that in any way wants to provide a service or support into those Olympics, you've got to have information on your sustainability plan and your emissions. We're seeing, I had one of a fantastic customer that's based in Melbourne, who I tend to describe our customer cohort as, and these numbers are made up, so please don't quote me on them, but we kind of got like 10% who are all over it, and they are, you know, leading the way and doing like really like amazing things, like really very inspirational how they're thinking about this problem and the impact that they can have. And typically that will be where there will be an individual owner, leader, chair that's just personally passionate about this space. Then we've got 10% roughly at the other end who just doesn't even want to talk about it, go away, not interested, which is fine, and I'm very respectful of that as well. And then we've got this cohort in the middle who, you know, actually are really interested, really want to do something, but actually they've got more pressing issues and they don't know where to start. They can't find staff, their costs are increasing. And often in something like this where you don't know where to start, you got to actually pay a bit of money out the door to kind of figure out what you want to do here. And so it's very, very hard for businesses. But this really fantastic customer down in Melbourne was in that bottom 10% of laggards, where it's just like, Sarah, like, don't even want to talk to you about this, which frankly, at a dinner, I don't always want to talk about it either. So I was very happy with that. And then I was in, that was maybe, I think that was back in June when I first met him. I was in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and he wanted to have some time with me. So I had a full hour with him, talking about mandatory reporting, which is coming through, and it was triggered by this guy runs a very successful kind of electrical services company, and he supplies up to some very big construction companies. And suddenly he got this new clause in his contract with some of the big players on, you know, tell us about your emissions or your sustainability plan. And he said to the guys, like, what's going on here? What's this clause? And I said, I haven't got a clue. That my lawyer told me I had to put it in. But that's what's happening, right? And I actually thought, well, what a fabulous conversation that I'm now actually spending an hour with this person, kind of helping him to better understand sustainability and why, like, why is he starting to get asked that question? And I know Nick will probably cover the why in the mandatory climate reporting, but it is coming, and it's coming down. It's not just the entities that are getting caught up in the scope of the mandatory reporting. It's coming from consumers, as I said, employees, capital providers, all the rest of it. So it's a fascinating space, and really interested. We'll have a panel discussion later on, so I'm really interested how all of you think about it, and both from an opportunity and a risk perspective as well. Put a key takeaway down the bottom there, which I'll just spend a minute on. And so just in terms of the supporting businesses, probably the only other point to make there is it is really about where customers are in their journey. And our support needs to match where they are. And so whether that's my lovely customer in Melbourne who really is at the beginning of his journey versus the ones that are ready for sustainable finance, capital investment, our job is often information and often kind of connection. And I really encourage, all of you to reach out if you do need help in any way in your journey. And we are there to help in many different ways. But when we help customers, in particular at the early stages of their journey, one of the things that I always say to them is it's actually about not just kind of having a sustainability plan or a strategy or goals kind of separate over here that is like outside of your core strategy or what you're trying to actually achieve as an organization within your own right. It's very important that it actually aligns to the values and the strategic goals of your organization. And the reason that that's very important is you've actually got to embed this stuff throughout the organization if you actually want to achieve your goals. And if it's kind of standing over here on the side and just doesn't make sense or doesn't align, you actually find it very, very difficult to execute your plan and actually achieve the outcomes that you're after. So if I was to give kind of any takeaways, it's about properly taking the time to really think through of all the different things that we could do here and that are important to us. What are the things that align very closely with their values and our organizational goal? So that's it from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Nick, and I'll see you again at the panel in a little while. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's a hard act to follow because I think you covered off most of the general content. And I'll go forward and I'm back around the why. I think Sarah covered off very, very well. And I was sitting there sort of, ticking off a number of the conversations I've had with organisations, whether it be management, some of our own internal colleagues and stakeholders around why would we be considering going down an ESG path, making further disclosures around sustainability, and in particular around climate, when Sarah sort of pointed out, many organisations are facing a huge number of challenges, whether that be just delivering on their core mission, recruitment, of retaining quality staff, dealing with their external stakeholders in terms of maintaining their business as usual, and then bringing into it another framework which they may need to consider and respond to, which for some organisation, mandatory climate-related disclosures will be that. It'll be seen as an impost. It's another external reporting requirement that some organisations will need to comply with. And it's very rigorous and there's a lot in it. But having discussions and focusing on the why really does circle around and integrating into the core aspects of what organisations want to achieve, what their strategies are, and what their purpose is. And that's why I think it is relevant for the majority of the organisations in this room. As we step through it, you may be outside the scope of mandatory climate-related disclosures, and so that might mean that you don't have necessarily that burning platform from a regulatory perspective to prepare and disclose climate-related information. But you're going to be caught up somewhere in the value chain, whether that be an external funder, an external client who's going to, on a procurement basis, is going to start asking those questions, or your people. And that's, again, your internal people or potentially your donors and your other stakeholders. Once the mandatory framework kicks in, there's going to be that increased awareness. So, and, most organisations here are for-purpose led, and if you think about the impacts of your core mission on certain elements of your community, a lot to do with mandatory disclosure. A lot to do with ESG and adopting a more sustainable position is probably largely aligned with what your organisations are looking to achieve. So I'll sort of blast through here. Share a little bit on the legislative framework. We'll talk around the two key standards, which are the AASB 1 and S1 and S2. And then we'll talk a little bit on the getting started. So if it is something you're interested in, and your organisation may be somewhere around, a couple of tips and tricks around how things progress that way. So just a snapshot for those who aren't aware. In the Australian context, the mandatory reporting legislation was passed in September 2024, so very recently, and that mandates that from 1 January 2025, for the largest entities in the economy, are going to need to start mandatory reporting climate information. It is a phased approach, which we'll step through over a number of years. And it does include the requirement for assurance to be provided over there. So if your organisation currently has an external financial audit being taken place, that same audit approach is going to be applied over the climate-related information. And it includes information which is very different to what is being historically reported externally for organisations in a financial report. And that includes scenario analysis, which is very challenging to contemplate. So as I mentioned, the two standards that have been adopted in the Australian context, they mirror to a large extent the international sustainability standards. These are handed down by the same board that hands down our accounting standards that we apply in Australia. And so our accounting standards board in the Australian context, the Australian Accounting Standards Board, have adopted these in a similar form. So from an external reporting, we're seeing convergence in Australia. So sustainability reporting and standards are being handed down by the same boards and the same standard setters that our financial reporting standards come from. And that's going to take a similar approach on the assurance side. So if there's any accountants in the room, you're sitting in a finance role within your organisation, you may start to see that sustainability merges towards some greater responsibility or some oversight from finance functions as well. And the Australian government's made it very clear that they're keen to align our reporting with international reporting, which is useful, as Sarah said, in the European context. There are some further advancements, and while there are some minor differences within the frameworks under each of these legislation, they're largely based on the TCFD, which is another acronym you'll come across. So most organisations, most jurisdictions are adopting some form of these standards. And it's interesting that there was a report from the ISSB just earlier this week, which did some analysis on reporting across the globe, and it said up to about 1,000 entities who are already disclosing, making some reference to the international sustainability standards. And I think there's about 30 jurisdictions who are adopting some form of this similar framework. And it may be a surprise for some in the room, but that includes the USA. So while there's some context in the US and around, from a political standpoint, their main regulator has proposed the adoption of sustainability standards. There's probably some way to go before that will be mandated, and California as a standalone state is pushing hard on there. So, and that will be a similar framework to what we're looking at here in Australia. Don't take all this in there. You can be in the slides, but really what it's just showing is that this has progressed really quickly. So from November 2021 at the top of that table, through to 1 January 2025. It's a huge volume of activity. And if anyone's seen the adoption of accounting standards or other regulatory frameworks phased in previously, the speed at which this has come to market is very, very rapid. So with that, some entities will feel like they're catching up. But when you look at it, most are other than the largest organisations such as CBA and others in the economy who have made great head starts in disclosing voluntarily in earlier times, most entities are catching up very quickly. So what do the standards require? They really cover off on or looking for four main areas from reporters, and that's information around governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So if you think about our financial reporting standards, that's largely numbers focused. We're looking at income statements, balance sheets, and the like. As you see here, that's only one metric or one pillar here, being that fourth about metrics, where the other three are talking about things which many organisations, and particularly some in this room already, do pretty well. You've got governance in place. You have some strategy, and most organisations are focused to some extent on risk. The difference here is that it's accelerated and it's focused on climate specifically, which obviously becomes that opportunity to, as Sarah said, fully integrate any climate-related strategy into your strategy of your overall organisation. And that's going to become more critical if entities are looking to disclose information, and directors and stakeholders want a degree of comfort and assurance over that information. Where did that come from? Was that a strategy that someone whisked up and just had in place, or how do you actually demonstrate that that's a strategy that's embedded across an organisation, and that the organisation has true ambitions to see that fulfill into action? Because it includes forward-looking information, which again, most who in the room who might be cautious about, or directors may be cautious about putting any forward-looking information or making statements about what an organisation may do in the future, you want a really good basis to be comfortable in putting this information out there. So it does take an all-of-organisation approach to consider these items. Probably should have started with this one, but who's captured by the standards? It's the usual suspects, but it's any organisation at the moment who needs to prepare and lodge financial statements under the Corporations Act. Now, as it applies to not-for-profits, if there's an entity that is registered with the ACNC, you're scoped out of mandatory disclosures. So you don't need to comply with the mandatory disclosures. And that there's the but, you may want to do something. But obviously some not-for-profit organisations who aren't registered with the ACNC and meet our size thresholds, we will step through shortly, you will be captured. And those size thresholds, so it's and this is to do with the phasing in. So our first group, which other than the CBA themselves, there's probably no one in the room who's captured by that. That's the largest organisation. But when you step down to group 3, that's any organisation that has 100 or more employees, 25 million or more of assets, or 50 million in revenue. And so that they would need to be start disclosing from July 2027. So it's not too far away, particularly when you think about the amount of work that's going to need to be done to get there. And the assurance requirements follow through. So similar to the phasing in of the mandatory disclosures, getting your external auditor across the assurance, it phases in a similar time frame. But what's of interest is even in that first year of reporting, there's limited assurance being provided over some of that information that's going to be disclosed. And it's, again, let's go back to my point, it's actually quite challenging information to disclose. It's not just information that's been generated out of your accounting or finance system. It's information to do with your governance, your strategy, and being able to demonstrate that to an external party that that's the strategy of the organisation. So similar to financial reporting, these standards include the concept of materiality. And in this context, it's any information, if omitted, or misstating or obscuring the information is expected to influence decision makers the primary users. So similar to the financial materiality concept, but this is the concept of materiality is going to be applied not just across climate related information, but it's going to be applied across other ESG information when these mandatory disclosures expand. And I should have sort of skipped over that point. In the current regulatory rollout from the international standards, climate has come first, and that's the standard that's been released and become mandatory in Australia and all jurisdictions. But the standard setters have a pathway to produce standards which are going to cover, or proposed to cover across the full suite of sustainability issues. So there's under development is nature-related disclosures, which we may see phased in future years, and we could anticipate there's going to be standards requiring mandatory disclosures on things such as social and wider governance issues as well. So coming off for ESG. So this materiality concept is going to apply across all those areas. Climate risks. Sarah touched on this to a certain extent. And when we talk about risk under the standards, there is the physical risks. So what is climate change or potentially going to impact on our physical assets, and there's the transition risks. So on the assumption that the economy is going to transition to a lower carbon environment, lower carbon economy, what impacts is that going to have on our organisation as the rest of the economy transition? So at the moment, if your exposure to an industry that is heavy in carbon or is somewhere related, how is your organisation going to transition as you go through there? And again, a lot of focus is on the risks, but there's opportunities here as well, and we need to disclose the opportunities to our organisation, both in the physical form and also through that transition process. The standards require you to do some modelling on the assumption that the climate, the temperature in the environment actually changes. So what is the impact if temperature does increase within thresholds on your operations? So again, I'm an accountant by background. I can deal with numbers. I'm not a climate scientist. We need to get climate scientists involved. There's more and more information coming out. But these are challenging things. But it does require boards and organisations to sit there and say, okay, if temperature does rise, what might that happen, or what might that impact on our organisation? So if you've got workforce or individuals working in the community who are exposed potentially outdoors, what impact may increasing in temperature have on them, and how are you as an organisation going to respond to that, increasing natural disasters and the like. These are some examples. So transition risks, policy and legal, obviously covers off a number of things there, and then the physical risks. So there's a lot of thought being put into this there, and fortunately that there's organisations who are already disclosing, and there's a lot of information around, but it needs to be considered and tailored specifically to your organisation, and then adopted within your strategies and within your risk registers and the like. I've had a discussion with some organisations around whether they maintain separate risk registers and strategies for climate, or whether to integrate within their core risk registers and strategies. I think it needs to be combined. It makes it front of mind, and also some of these strategic opportunities and or risks are going to not only impact your climate and not only impact you from a sustainability position, but actually impact your all-over organisation. Look, scope 1, 2 and 3. So what are emissions? Similar to Sarah, the discussion around what does ESG, we're finding more and more individuals are now becoming aware of what scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions are. Very briefly, come out of the greenhouse gas protocols. They're not necessarily a new concept, but it has been adopted throughout most of the legislation that's been being promoted and most frameworks. So Scope 1 emissions are emissions that your organisation produces itself. So if you've got energy producing, you might have Scope 1. Scope 2 is typically your purchased electricity and other carbon. And then Scope 3 is everything else. And the real challenge when you talk about emissions measurement with most organisations is, where does your Scope 3 start and stop? And how do you go about measuring that with any degree of accuracy? There is a degree of subjectivity around this, but it's about using your materiality, setting some boundaries, disclosing based on those boundaries, and it is iterative. We see many organisations undertake a baseline measurement and then in future periods measure to a greater degree of certainty. And there's more and more solutions, largely sort of software and the like, that are coming into play, which can help organisations through these measurement exercises. Yes, okay. So measuring emissions, as I mentioned, a typical exercise for an organisation to approach measurement would be first to determine your boundaries. So as I said, using that concept of materiality, engaging with your stakeholders and finding out what is material and important to them, you set a boundary, and then you go about identifying your sources of emissions. And that's if you've got a little diesel generator somewhere on your site, whether you're using gas and refrigerants and everything else in your business, or your organisation, I should say, you go around and identify those. Selecting calculation approaches, again, not an exact approach. There are a number of different ways that you can go about calculation. So it is about choosing one approach that you think is going to be most applicable to your organisation, collecting the data, applying the calculation tool. So once you've actually got some of this information, it then does become maths. It's one number multiplied by another number, and gives you your emissions that you've generated. And then you need to aggregate this up across your organisation and choose how you're going to report. This is put this slide in because I think it's important for entities or organisations in the room who may not be caught directly within the scope of mandatory reporting to think about why you as an organisation may want to go down a path. And it may not be getting to the stage of putting all the information together that would be disclosed in a full S1, S2 compliant mandatory report. But it's probably going to be having in place a strategy, identifying your key risks, and undertaking an emissions measurement. Sarah mentioned as well the supply chain partners. It's very likely that we're going to see more and more funding being tied to organisation sustainability positions. So it could be an expectation that when you're filling in those applications and discussions with donors or other funders, that there's going to be expectations around your organisation's sustainability position. Risk management, obviously, if everybody else starts moving towards this sort of disclosure, you don't want to be the entity left behind. And the social license. This is going to be really relevant, I believe, to this sector. We're for-purpose organisations. With that, there may become an increased expectation that we're also doing our bit to disclose and access to capital. And so I think Sarah articulated that very well. Potentially, you may be either excluded from being able to access certain capital. Capital could be repriced, or on an opportunity side, there may be new forms of capital and products which are going to be available to you. So the getting started, the what next? Engage, have the discussions internally and externally with your stakeholders, understand what's going to be important to them, then collaborate And again, you may need to speak with external parties. We're more than happy to have a discussion with everyone around what a pathway may look like for you and your organisation. It's not a one size fits all, but putting in place a plan to start working to get towards that. And then that last point there, I think it's truly important to integrate your sustainability strategy within your core strategy of your organisation, because it's going to give it the prominence that's required to actually see some action. But also there's just that crossover, anything to do with discussion with risks and strategy and opportunities, I think should be tied into your core strategy. Open up to the floor if there's any questions that anybody here has we'd like to throw out. Hands coming up.
Good afternoon, Andrew Condon. Interested in one of your slides. Most of the organisations here would be registered under ACNC, and the carve out for ACNC registered entities is my question. One of the boards I'm on is 4,000 employees, 2 billion in assets, $250 million a year revenue, and needs to be in this space. So do you have a sense why the carve out was there? And, you know, clearly there's opportunities for, a number of levels to bring, the charity sector into this space where it's relevant and where they're capable.
If you followed the very rapid standard development and the commentary that was involved there, I think there were submissions. There were submissions that suggested the carve out wasn't necessary and that those entities should be captured. I would expect that there was representations from some in the sector pointing out the potential impost on organisations, because it is an expense. It's going to be an expensive exercise for entities to prepare the sustainability related reporting. There's a finite number of specialists in the industry at the moment who are available to assist. The large corporates who have you captured in those group one in particular, using a lot of those resources. So I think it's probably a not now approach. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in time the legislation is revised and those larger entities will be captured within there, because it is a very specific carve out for those ACNC registered entities. So nothing more than that.
Thank you.
Just on the ACNC, Kim, we've got them coming. We have January, so you could pose those questions to the ACNC directly when they come.
Sorry, did you want to answer that first?
Look, we can pose it to them, and I think it will. My response is going to be that I think you'll see some larger organisations who may voluntarily start some level of activity, so that they are ready, or they are going to have that information available to disclose to their stakeholders, because the mandatory reporting is only one driver of a sustainability strategy. So I think you might see some pressure from boards and other stakeholders to advance, even if they're specifically excluded.
Hi, Carmel from the Non-Profit Alliance. Just further to the first question, isn't it only a matter of time really that the corporates are going to put pressure on the charity partners that they work with, because essentially they are a stakeholder and they'll be looking to report through mandatory reporting about who they work with and how those people are meeting the targets. So there's the bury the head in the sand, I think, thing that's probably hanging over our heads at the moment about that. And I guess the second part of the question is the resourcing associated with that is obviously going to be a massive problem. So how we can look at those issues.
It's a very good question. It's definitely happening with suppliers, for example. That's been happening for a while. If you're a supplier to Commonwealth Bank or any other equivalent corporate, you'll have to answer those questions. I don't know, because I think you've got to take a balanced approach, right? In particular, if you're partnering with a very small charity or not-for-profit. Like, you've got to also be a bit realistic on expectations of organizations. I would probably think what will be more likely to happen would be, you know, and we do this even from a risk perspective, like we do like what we call kind of negative screening searches, right? So certainly if you had an organization, charity or otherwise, and for some way was in any way, because I mean, you can have a charity that does stuff that's not very environmental or not very positive from a social outcomes perspective. I think there'll be maybe more about, well, we actually don't want to engage with that particular organization because they don't align to our values and sustainability strategy. I think it may be more that. However, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see, but I would like to think that would be a balanced approach, because to Nick's point, like, it's some of this stuff is not easy in terms of the data. Yeah.
I might just address the resourcing question there. And two comments on resourcing. The first is that it has to be a whole of organisation approach. I don't believe that you're going to be able to drive this purely out of finance, and it becomes another obligation of the head of finance. Likewise, if you've currently got a sustainability or someone within an organisation with sustainability or ESG attached to their title, which may be sitting across in policy or public relations, that again, they can't drive this on their own. So it does need that all of organisation approach. And then within organisations that already have finite resources, how do you do that? So it's more a comment than an answer. And the second one is that we're seeing more and more products come to market which are going to assist small and medium-sized entities. And so these are software solutions and similar, which are going to allow organisations to start down an approach with I guess keep someone passionate and potentially some lighter external help, but it's going to help start that process without needing to start from a big bang external consulting process.
Hi, Nina Matson-Bone, and I'm interested to pick up on your comment, Nicholas, on the 4 kind of buckets around governance, strategy, risk management, and the measurement and targets. In relation to how cumbersome the measurement and targets piece is going to be, when I think about the boards and organisations I'm involved with, some of them already are working on the strategy and governance piece of this. I'm on the board of the Australian Institute for Architects, for example, and we very much look at the sustainability piece quite specifically from a strategic perspective. I'm interested in your comments on how much the mandatory reporting is going to actually have a negative effect around the strategy piece, because the metrics and targets will become cumbersome to the point that it affects our ability to be strategic.
Scenario analysis in that metrics is really it's going to be really challenging for some organisations. It's going to be drawing on boards to be able to gain comfort over future-looking scenarios on concepts which they may have never had to think about. So yes, absolutely cumbersome. There is the materiality concept, so that's going to be important when you're looking at from an organisational perspective. Make sure that you haven't set your materiality boundary too narrow, because that you may be pulling into scope some scenarios which may be the impacts of which may not be material on your organisation or on stakeholders in the organisation. But yes, very cumbersome. And talking to many in the space, they see that as being the most challenging part of the mandatory disclosures is being able to set set those targets and then be able to measure, collect the data, accurate, reliable data, and then be able to quantify it and measure for an organisation. Is it going to impact negatively on strategy? Possibly, if it's not, if it's not done to the right materiality.
Thank you. Hi, Nikki Kelso from Service and Creative Skills Australia. I'd be really interested, following on from Nina's question around other unintended consequences. By way of example, the trend to return to the office would potentially increase energy consumption. Are we going to see a push back to hybrid working so that all of those energy costs are now individual rather than organisational? And what other trends you might see that we're not expecting at this stage?
I'll have a crack at that one. And Agneta, you might actually have some interesting things to add just in terms of at least the larger scale carbon projects. Like if we take a step back and think about what is the most meaningful thing that can be done to decarbonise or reduce the carbon emissions in Australia, it essentially comes down to the grid and electricity and switching to renewable sources. So we can have, and I'm actually a big, massive proponent in like all the little steps and just like all the individual things that we can all do. But ultimately, the biggest thing is going to be renewable energy and shifting away from fossil fuels in terms of energy generation. The other two big sectors, or the three big sectors, are transport. So point is very valid, and transport. And I think, you know, in some scenarios there are low carbon alternatives. You know, we've now got electric vehicles, but like trucks, is not really very many trucks that can do long haulage across Australia that can actually are effectively can, you know, that there's a good solution. Flights, big massive one. You know, there's not great options there yet. You can get sustainable aviation fuel, but exactly, I can see. So there are certain buildings is the other one. So commercial buildings is the other big source of emissions. But ultimately, if you like change your electricity source to renewables, that will all kind of flow through to buildings as well. And obviously agri is a massive one, and in particular in the Australian context, agri is huge, but a lot of the time it's a really, really, really difficult sector to abate and reduce emissions in. And so like maybe there will be some kind of minor things like that, but I don't think they're going to be the most meaningful thing for companies to do to reduce their emissions. So I don't think it will shift at that micro level. But Agneta, you will probably have a nice, interesting view.
Oh, I completely agree, actually. I think if I think about the LGC market, which is your large-scale generation certificates, they are used for voluntary demand surrender for your Scope 2 renewable energy certificates. We've seen an oversupply over the past year and limited participation in that demand side. And that means that most people are transitioning now, both from an affordability lens and also environmental lens, into renewable energy. So that's definitely big in the sector, and particularly in the SME space, smaller entities that are not the large corporates. They're now the next uptake. So they're moving into renewable electricity, renewable energy, whether it's VPP networks or actual PPAs that they're contracting.
I might just talk to another unintended consequence, and that's we've seen maybe in the public market entities where the organisations have been ambitious in what they've disclosed to market around their climate and potentially their carbon status, and the regulator, so ASIC, for those entities has been very clear in terms of the term greenwashing, and being very encouraging organisations to be very cautious around what they disclose to their stakeholders. And I think that's going to apply not just to public entities, but it's going to be to all organisations, whether we're making those statements to our sponsors, our donors, our employees, making sure that there is a good basis for whatever is disclosed there. So it is, I think that's balance between being ambitious and trying to take action as an organisation, but being also cautious around what can be achieved by when and what's disclosed in relation to that.
Thank you. Mary Ramsey. Just off the back of that, Nicholas, I just wondered how you're seeing the shift from board strategy to action, where boards are actually trying to invest into big funds managed by investment fund managers. And when they've got a mandate that says go and invest in ESG, how are we seeing the shift, and how do we get the verification and avoid that greenwashing? And I suppose your other point, are we seeing any shifts in the performance of ESG over boards just saying, well, there's no profitability there, or go back to there's too much risk or ambiguity, I'll go back to just investing in high growth assets.
I'll share an initial comment, and then Sarah and Agneta might have some thoughts as well. I think there's the trust element is incredibly important, and I think that's part of the reason why the rush by the legislators in the Australian context to bring this S1 and S2 standards to market, to give some more rigour around that and understand. So you're comparing apples with apples. I think ASIC is doing a good job at keeping everyone alert in terms of product funds managers, being alert to what can be disclosed there. And I also think, and anecdotally, I don't think there's been a slowdown in the desire from fund or capital allocators to see their funds be allocated to for purpose or sustainable projects. So I'm not sure. There's absolutely caution, but I think it's heading in the right direction if with the recognised frameworks.
I can't speak to exactly your question around kind of board decisions and kind of withdrawing or kind of investing more in ESG or sustainability related funds. But I was reading something the other day about, it was kind of like I can't remember if it was global context or European context, but it was about the trillions of investment in these type of funds. And it has actually dropped down a little bit. But my understanding was not because of a lack of intent or appetite, to Nick's point, but actually because of the scrutiny, some funds are actually having to kind of delabel themselves. And so until they do a bit more work to kind of get back up there again, there's slightly less funds out there in the market, as I understand it. Yeah.
Add a little bit to that in terms of our exposures into carbon measurement firms and carbon technology. I think that as the years go, there is levels of sophistication for carbon measurement that's really uplifting now, and even with climate disclosures that are coming in. I think previously it was very difficult to measure carbon emissions inside a portfolio. It's very difficult to see within Scope 3, but that's really changing, and the requirements are uplifting. So at a fund level, even if we look at the Future Fund, which is the Federal Government Sovereign Fund, there has been talk about pushing through legislation that requires ESG credentials to be proved out for all of their investments. So for a fund themselves, instead of actually certifying their carbon emissions, they'll just require their upstream to show for their accounting on that basis. And as Nick mentioned, I think representation and greenwashing risks are real for these funds, and certainly some of them have started to walk back some of those claims. But there's no shortage of green capital out in the market, and no shortage of true intentions to invest in more green label type products. Climate risk is real, and there is value at risk for certain assets within a portfolio on a long-term basis, and superannuation funds are acutely aware of that, I think.
Just one other soundbite. I was chatting to a guy who works in a social impact venture capital fund just at a conference last week, and it was kind of on this topic. And the challenge he was having was, we've got like loads of money to deploy. We just can't find enough high quality projects. Like at the end of the day, again, it comes back to that kind of trifecta of environmental, social, and economic. Like you can't have something that's amazing on the S, for example, but economically it's not viable. And so that's actually, but then it kind of becomes come full circle. Well, then actually, does more capital need to be invested in, again, research, development, like the early stage stuff, acknowledging that they won't all become viable, but who plays that role to kind of have more viable projects and initiatives coming through the investment funnel that will be successful. So it's a very tricky one.
That'll be our last question. Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
No?
Look, the other thing a lot of us in this room are interested in is charitable fundraising. And you just mentioned there organisations that have lots of funds to deploy. I'm just wondering whether you've seen yet, particularly in the carbon market, any sort of innovative approaches to using it as a fundraising sort of mechanism for the charitable sector. And in fact, I asked the question out to everybody. Is that something that Corinne here's smiling madly. Is that something that people have contemplated, because it is potentially an opportunity?
Oh yes, absolutely. Be very happy to chat. I've got lots of ideas. But I think as a smaller starting point, one can think about a carbon neutral type event. You can look at carbon credits or projects that you're supporting. But the precursor to all of that is really measurement. So you measure your emissions based on that event, and then you offset it accordingly. There's certainly other opportunities to invest directly into a project, environmental plantings project, whether it's geographically within the same state or something that interacts with the ecosystem or biodiversity ecosystems that you have interactions with as an entity. Those are interesting ways to think about it. So that direct kind of linkage into a project we can certainly support too.
Just the only thing I'll add to that, and I know we're out of time, but what we're increasingly seeing in some of the sustainable finance products that we offer to our customers, where essentially it'll be general kind of corporate purpose debt, but you'll have a wrapper around it with very specific either environmental or social targets. And it's really interesting some of the targets that companies are kind of signing up to as part of, and you get a discount on your funding as a part of this structure. And often it could be like working with a not-for-profit to hire more Indigenous people into the workforce, or it could be, we had one recently where it's about protecting a particular species on the land that they're like. So there is, again, it kind of comes back to people need and want a story to tell here, right? And so, not exactly the question you're asking, but like, I think there is an opportunity there for charities to step in and work with these companies who have an imperative, whether through brand, reputation, whatever it might be. I think there's an opportunity to work with them, which is a kind of win-win for everybody.
I'd like to thank our speakers.
Anita and Nicholas. What a absolutely huge topic that is. I was sitting there listening to all of that, and I must say there was a little bit of that happening. And I tried my very best because I'm not the numbers girl. But I think we've all got to get our heads around this. At whatever level we sit in an organisation, we all have a part to play. Certainly going to have to read up on lots of things. So can you believe that this is our last ENFP briefing for 2024, and next year is our 15th year? Can you believe that? We started out with a group of CEOs sitting at a boardroom table, and we had 5 of them. I think one of them may have been in the room sitting over there for all of these years. And it was all about what was it that they were missing? What didn't they have access to? And what they didn't have access to was a network of people that looked like them. There were lots of other incredible networks out there, but it was apples to oranges. It wasn't apples to apples. And so we started out our first little ENFP, which then had 15 people, and we had 10 people in our LinkedIn community. We now have 2,500 individuals, which is just incredible. And it's the impact that we saw. That I thank you, and I thank you, and I thank you all for allowing us to be able to stand here and present to you, to be able to impact on the community and to invest in the community. I mean, I know from HLB Man Judd's perspective, and I can certainly say CommBank, it is all about the impact. It's impact in the end user. Whatever we can do to upskill everyone in the room and provide more information and more education, the end user is always going to benefit. So you should thank yourselves, really, because you go back to your organisations and you tell them what you've heard, and you tell them what you've seen, and you've spoken to each other. I know I'm rambling a little bit, but sometimes you need a little day in the sun. Morelle Thornton, who was one of our first members, was the former chair of cerebral palsy, an incredible, incredible woman. And she sat on one of the first tables, and there was a young 19-year-old girl there who had just started at Red Cross. Now, she had no idea who the person beside her was. And Morelle Thornton, she was a sponge to this young girl.
whatever questions this young girl had, Morel was there to give her guidance and focus. And I know that after all of these years, she still speaks to Morel and she still gets advice and she still gets guidance. And that's what we wanted people here to do, to talk to each other, to benefit from the work that you're all doing and collaborate on that level. So I've got a couple of dates for you. I'm not expecting you to take them all down. But next Wednesday, the 20th of November, we are holding a webinar on remuneration. And so that's from Enterprise Care. They provide a remuneration survey every year. And I think they ended up having something like 500 participants in the sector, which is quite incredible. So that's next Wednesday. I know the invitations have gone out, but I'll also put it back up on LinkedIn. Then we have the most famous Christmas party, which is called the ENFP's Christmas party, which of course is ours. And that's on the 12th of December. No one knew that date until we got here today, till we did a bit of a tick with the team at CommBank. So thank you again so much, and thank you to Blake. So we'll get those invitations out to you. And then our next year, our 15th year. So we're going to kick off our year, which is what we do every year with the ACNC. Unfortunately, Sue Woodward was unable to attend on the 19th of February. However, we have the Deputy Commissioner, Natasha Sekulik, and she will be presenting and she'll provide an update from the ACNC. But we also have two representatives from the AASB board, which is Frederick Huser and Maggie Lee. So I thank you all again for attending today. It's been a very big 2024 for us all, but I'm sure we're looking forward to 2025 and whatever that brings. So looking forward to seeing you all on the 12th of December. Thank you, everyone.